So this is the third lesson in week 2, and it's going to focus on creating a good user interface and a good user experience when you create your patches. You should imagine whenever you create a patch and submit it as an assignment that the person receiving your patch has no idea how Max operates or how to go into edit mode and presentation mode. You should consider that you're giving them a finished application that should be intuitive, well organized, and contain instructions in any situation where instructions are needed. So don't just assume that you're sending it to me and I know what I'm doing, so I'm going to figure it out. What I usually say is, imagine you're sending this to your mother through the internet and telling her, "Mom, can you operate this patch? Does it make sense to you?" Without telling them that they have to do this or that. It should be absolutely self-explanatory and intuitive. And if it's not, then it's not a good interface design. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few things that I'm expecting for your first assignment. And I should say that the first assignment is that the calculations are part of the assignment, but they're actually not that complicated. They're pretty simple calculations. So a lot of your energy is going to go into creating a good user experience and a good user interface with color and sizes that are appropriate and so on. All right, so the first thing I wanted to talk about is that when you have multiple objects, let's say a slider and a number box that are really referring to the same information, they must be kept in sync. So, but there are some issues when you do that. So here I have an example where I have a slider and the slider is going into a number box. Well, that's important because there's no point having a slider unless I can actually see what values are coming out of that slider. It's usually a good idea when you're using a slider or a dial to have some kind of indication of what those values are. But the problem here is that I'm outputting the value of my number box into the slider. The reason I'm doing that is because I want to be able to set this value either by using the slider or by using the number box. The problem I have is that this creates a loop. Because when I put a number into my slider, it goes into the number box, which then goes into the slider, which goes into the number box, and then goes into the slider, and basically creates a loop forever and ever. This is not a good thing. And most programs will crash and lock up and do all kinds of nasty things. If I do this in Max, you'll see what happens. I get this message that comes up which says slider stack overflow and outlets have been disabled until this message is cleared. So Max has stopped, and a stack overflow simply means that the number of messages of actions that have been piled up in the stack to be operated has overflowed the stack's capability of holding messages. In other words, there are a gazillion messages there which are basically looping one after another. So we need to clear this. This is bad. This is a problem. So, but we don't want these to be just independent. So if I could fix this problem by removing that. But now I have a problem because the slider can control the number box, but the number box does not control the slider. I don't like this as a user because those two pieces of information which are referring to the same piece of information are not in sync with one another. Don't like that. So what is the solution? Well, the solution is to use a message which says set and then space $1. And what the set $1 message does is $1 means the first value, if there happens to be a list, either the value that's coming in or the first value in a list that's coming in, I'm going to use that value to set the value of the object that's receiving it without causing that object to pass the value on. So it's a little bit different than usually when we go in the first inlet, we cause the object to perform its operation. But here what's happening is the object is simply setting the receiving object to a value, but not causing that output. So now I can do this, and I don't get an error message. I can adjust the number box, and the slider sets. Or I can adjust the slider, and the number box sets. So that's a good solution whenever you have two objects that you want to link together so that they're in sync. Use a set number sign 1 between one of those objects so you don't create a loop. Okay, so that's the first thing you want to make sure you do if you're using sliders and dials and objects like that in your assignment. The second thing is that when most interface objects, when they open up in your patch, they default to a value of 0. And it doesn't matter what value they had when you last closed the patch. When it opens, they are set back to 0. So it's sometimes, actually it's very often, useful to set default values to an object so that when it opens, it has a value in there, a value that makes more sense than just 0. And to do that, we use load mess object followed by an argument, which is the message, or alternatively a load bang message. Load bang does the same thing. Switch this to that one. The load bang message sends a bang when the patch is loaded. So I could do the same thing by having a load bang message with a value of 12 and putting that, let's say, into an integer box so that when this patch opens, what happens, I'm going to double click on this, when the patch opens, the value of 12 will be passed into that number box. So load mess or load bang basically perform the same kinds of operations. They will cause the value or the bang to be passed as soon as the patch is loaded. Okay, so it's a way in which we can set default values to the patch. So you can see this one has been set to 16 so that when the patch opens, the slider was sent to 16, but because the slider is connected to a number box, the number box is also set to 16. Okay, something that is very useful when you are when you need, especially if you need default values to be put into your patch. If you're doing something like, let's say, a conversion, and you have a default conversion value of, let's say, American dollars to Canadian dollars, then it might make sense to load that into your object when your patch opens, rather than having the user have to type a conversion value in. That's not something the user should have to do. Okay, so load message and load bang. I can't think of an object that or a patch that I've ever written that did not have at least one load mess or load bang message in it. Okay. The other thing you might want to do, or you should do with interface objects, is to be aware of the inspector and the characteristics that objects can have. So if here's an example where I have two number boxes, and these number boxes, I want to limit the range of values that these number boxes have, and I can do that with the inspector. So this number box has a range of 0 to 127. So when I put my mouse in it and go up and down, I cannot go below 0. I cannot go above 127. This one has a range of -40 to 100, and I can't go above and below that. It also is a different color. So when I click on this in edit mode and go Command I or bring up the inspector, I can see all the characteristics of this particular number box. At the very bottom, I'm going to move this over so that you can see a little bit better. At the very bottom, you can see the minimum and maximum values have been set. But I can do all kinds of things. I can change the font size, I can change the font style, I can change the colors, I can choose to have a triangle drawn or not have a triangle drawn. The triangle kind of implies that the object is editable. If I don't want it to be editable, I can click on this ignore click, and then I can no longer edit this object. So it would essentially be an object that is only for display purposes. I can't actually alter it. That might be a useful thing to do if you have an object that is only going to be for display purposes. So all the characteristic colors and attributes of an object can be altered through the inspector, right? And that's something that you might want to do if you have a slider and a dial that are interconnected. What is the maximum range of the slider? If it's 0 through 127, then make sure that your number box also is limited to 0 through 127. So you don't have a situation like this where I can do that. Well, I did that with this one. I made it limited to 0 to 127. But if I didn't do that, let me set it so that they're not in sync. I'm going to make this 200. Right. But here's a situation where this can go up to 200, but my slider only goes to 127. So again, I'm not getting accurate data there because these values are not being displayed in the slider. Okay. It was working properly before I wrecked it. Okay. Setting the minimum maximum values. You can also set multipliers in things like sliders. So if I go down to the bottom of the slider, there's an output multiplier. So if it happens to be a slider where I want it to cover a much wider range of numbers, I might decide that I'm going to multiply it by 10 as a multiplier. Right? And I'm just going to disconnect this for a moment. But you can see now, right, that my slider is outputting values that are multiples of 10. Right? Now I have to be a little bit careful when I start setting the values because the slider value here, this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, 5, 9, 10. That's a value of 10 in the slider. So I can't just put 100 in here because the 100 will give me a value of 1,000. Right? So you have to be a little bit careful when you start using multipliers. If you do use a multiplier, you're going to have to do something like divided by 10. So the value that's coming out of here needs to be divided by 10 before it goes in and sets this incoming value. And this now is limited to something much higher. Okay, let's see if that works. Right? And they're both in sync again. Right? If that seems a little complicated, then just ignore it. Don't do multiplications. It's just simply that the sliders, the multiplication happens at the end of the slider. So the slider has a value of 10, and then the multiplication makes it 100. But then when you are putting in a value, you need to put in a value of 10, not 100. Okay? And you might have that happening. Okay, I'm just gonna ignore that. I won't save that. Next in our list of creating a beautiful interface is hiding components that you don't want visible in your patch. And to hide objects, what you do is you select them, and you can select them if you want to include the patch cords with the Option key held down. So I can select these components of my patch, and then I can use under the object the Show on Lock or Hide on Lock. So when I lock it, these are now visible, and if I hold down the Option key and drag through them and I go Hide on Lock, Command K, when I lock my patch, they are invisible. Now later on we'll be using presentation mode, but for the first assignment I like for students just to hide the objects that they don't need visible, and since push them out of the way and build a clean, well-organized patch, rather than relying on having a messy patch and relying on presentation mode to hide all of the garbage. So we're going to learn how to make clean, well-organized, nicely aligned patches. Okay, so 4 things. Interconnecting components that refer to the same data, such as sliders and dials, using the set number sign 1, using load message objects or load bang objects to initialize values when the patch opens, to set the characteristics, size, style, minimum, maximum, colors, etc. of your objects, to make sure that they are appropriate, that there's some sort of color coordination that makes sense for your patch, and hiding the components of your patch that you don't need to be visible. So I mean, think of this as let's take some kind of calculator. For your first assignment, you're going to be doing conversions of monetary conversions. Well, the user doesn't have to see the multiplication and division and calculations. They really just want to be able to put values into your application and to get the right values out in a clear, concise, and unambiguous way. Okay? Just like when you're running an application, you don't see lines of code. If you're playing a game, you don't see lines of code spewing up telling you what's going on inside the program. You don't need to see that. You simply need an interface to that code. And we're going to do the same thing with Max MSP. Here is an ugly patch. It does a calculation of some number plus 10 then multiplied by 5. And it does it correctly, more or less. But there are so many problems with this patch. This patch would not do very well as a Max MSP assignment in this course. There are problems with it. Okay, I've got a kind of enter a number, and I can put a number in like 125, and I can hit return. Now I don't know that I was supposed to do that, because there's actually nothing that tells me how I enter a number. But I'm going to assume I put a number in there and I hit return, and the answer I get is 67. Well, that's not the right answer. Well, it's not the right answer because this number box was actually not wide enough when it was designed. I'm going to move this out of the way for a moment. This number box was not big enough to actually hold the answer. These patch cords they're not aligned with one another, and I can see all the internal workings. And when I look at this patch, I don't even know that this is necessarily the answer. There's nothing that tells me that. So there's no color. The number box was too small. There's no labeling of components. Objects that should be hidden are visible. There are incomplete instructions. This is editable. What's the answer of this? I don't know. I can put my mouse in here and make it anything I want. So now I look at my patch and say 125 plus 10 multiplied by 5 is 33,312. Well, that's not right. So this should not be editable. This is to display results. Now you could say to yourself, well, don't edit it. Well, I did. And now I have a patch that's got incorrect results. It's a little bit like having a calculator where you can suddenly go in and say, well, actually, I don't like that answer. I'm going to change it to something else by touching it. So that is a bad patch. And I will not be happy. I will be crying like this little picture is crying if you send me something like this. And you will be crying when you get your mark back if you send me something like this. Here is an elegant patch. The instructions are clear. It's got a nice panel around it with nice colors. We haven't talked about panels. You can find panels up here somewhere. But I always just type the word panel and it creates a panel. And then you can use your inspector. I'll bring my inspector out and move it over so you can see it. Oops, there we go. So we can set the interior color, the border color of our panel, the roundness of the borders, the size of the borders. Let's make a border of 5. Why not? So it's nice and clear. And then the interior color can either be a solid color or it can be a gradient that moves between, let's say, red and blue. Whoops, it's not blue. There, blue. That's a bit extreme, but hey. And it will now look like this. And so we've got a nice thick bordered panel, and the panel can be resized. And you can select your panel and use the Arrange menu to send it to the back, for example. I'm going to put this around my happy face. Oops. There. Make it a little bit bigger. There we go. Okay, so you can have panels. This patch has got clearer instructions. It says enter a number between 0 and 100, and you'll see that this is actually already done the calculation. 0 plus 10 is 10. Times 5 is 50. So in fact, these are already aligned with one another. And if I click on that and type 23, it gives me the correct answer. And if I try to scroll in here, it'll go up, won't go above 100 and won't go below 0. And it always gives me correct values. I cannot edit this. So I can't, go in and say, well, I don't want it to be 550. I want it to be something else. So that patch works. It's got, I'm going to go into edit mode for a moment. You can see that it's got a load mess object, which passes the value 0 in here when the patch opens, which causes the calculation to take place, and the answer is put in there. And all of this has been hidden. These patch codes and these objects have been hidden. So it's obviously a very, very simple patch. But that's what we want to see when we create a patch with Max MSP. If we wanted to add a dial or something else, so we could link in the dial and the number box, and then we would use a set $1 to make sure that they were properly interconnected. Okay, so that's it for week 2. You should now be in a good situation to work on the assignment. Make sure that you do use floating point number objects for all of your mathematical operators if you're doing calculations. Make sure that you follow all the instructions, that you provide a default calculation for your currency conversions, but that you allow the user a mechanism where they can adjust those values. If refer to this particular patch for clues as to the kinds of things that I'm expecting you to do with interconnections of objects, with good choices of interface objects such as sliders and number boxes, making sure that you're dealing with floating point numbers when you display values. Here's another little hint. Let's say this slider. If this happened to be numbers, then one of the things I might want to do is go Command I and say it's going to be decimal floating point result, but somewhere in here I can set the number of decimal places. There it is, right here. How many decimal places? 2. Oh, that's nice. Now this looks like dollars and cents. Okay? And if it were dollars and cents, of course, I would put a comment with a dollar sign there so that I can see dollars and cents. Okay, so there, use the inspector to make sure that everything looks, I would say, completely professional, and make sure that your number boxes are large enough to hold the information that you're putting into them. That's a common mistake, and it may seem like, well, it doesn't really matter that much, but it would matter to someone who was using your program trying to get accurate results, and they discovered that they, for example, can't actually see what the number is that they're supposed to be getting. Are there no cents here? Right, so that's a simple thing. Just make it right. Okay, good luck with your assignment. Thank you.